I'm Janet Silver. Ontario Premier Doug Ford named his new cabinet Friday morning after winning a majority government earlier in June. This announcement comes one day after MPs left Ottawa to begin their summer recess. Joining me now are two seasoned political operatives and now my colleagues here at Syntax, Jon Dugal and Jake Enwright. And Jake, I'm going to start with you and Doug Ford's announcement today. Any surprises?
No, there wasn't. The cabinet is largely made up and signifies all of the individuals who helped Doug Ford modernize the Conservative movement in Ontario and make it more electable with centrist and non-ideological voters. And they're the same people who helped him skillfully stick handle all of the challenges of the pandemic. It's not a surprise at all that he's rewarded those people with continued posts and promotions.
Jon, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it just shows how pragmatic Doug Ford is, or has become more recently, certainly as Premier. There was a moment in time, maybe a couple months ago, where it seemed that some issues of the past might come back to haunt him, but he's really come back much stronger than ever in the last several months in terms of how he's dealt with the pandemic and responded to public outcries around the early on days of the pandemic. But it also just demonstrates that he's really true to what he said on election night, and that's that he's growing a Conservative coalition here that's going to be long-term and sustainable in how he builds it, no matter who the leader is that comes after him, by elevating some women and people of color to cabinet. If anything, there's a little shock on my part, just in terms of some of the ministers that have been around for a while and maybe have been performing well or are sufficiently big names on their own rights, that maybe deserved a promotion, if you will, because of that. Or in the case of Stephen Lecce, who's been in a bit of a pickle with the education file for a little while now. It's kind of interesting to see him remain there rather than shifting priorities.
So speaking of a couple of those women that you referenced there, Jon, Carolyn Maroney, she stays on as transport, but one woman who's switching gears, if you will, is Sylvia Jones. Jake, I just want you to touch on that because that's a pretty big portfolio. She's going to be Deputy Premier and Health Minister. What do you think this signals?
Well, it signals exactly what Jon just mentioned, this emphasis and focus on pragmatism. She's going to be a steady hand that can implement the structural changes that are needed in how we handle healthcare in Ontario. We all see it after the pandemic, the lessons learned. She's going to be that champion. And, you know, Jon mentioned some surprise with some people who stayed in cabinet, given some of the controversies that they've gone through. But Sylvia and others are a signal of the mandate that Doug Ford sought from Ontarians, which was steady as she goes, gets it done. So through Sylvia's promotion, through the people who have remained in cabinet, I think it largely signifies what he believes his mandate is to continue the work that he started on before the pandemic derailed him.
Now I'm going to switch from Queen's Park to Ottawa. As I mentioned earlier, MPs left Ottawa this week to begin their summer recess. Jon, I just want to go back over the past few months and throw this broad question out there, and that is any big accomplishments that you would have seen or noted in the past few months from the Liberal government?
Well, I'll be honest, I think the big accomplishment is in how many pieces of government legislation they actually got passed recently and how well functioning the committees were as a whole. I mean, coming into a minority government, the Conservatives had tried a couple of times to stalemate on a couple of big pieces of government legislation, including the budget at a point in time. But really, it comes back to that cooperation agreement that was struck early on between Prime Minister Trudeau and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, which appears to have come out of a very genuine personal relationship on their part. And it really helped the Liberals. I mean, at the time when it came out, many people were questioning, I think rightfully so, the need for such an agreement at this time. You know, as much as the Liberals wanted for sure some longevity or the promise of longevity in terms of this initial mandate, it didn't appear as if the NDP was going to be in a position to trigger an election anytime soon. But I think the critical piece there is that the cooperation agreement between the NDP and the Liberals, while yes, giving NDP a little bit of credence and a little bit of ability to actually set the agenda, let's say, for example, at the committee level, and I think that's going to be the piece to watch moving forward is what studies do they want to bring forward? How do they want to use the committees to really manipulate things in their favor? What it does is also allow the government to get through legislation in a timely fashion. So, I mean, even with the budget, it was quickly gone through committee largely non-controversial as well. I mean, the issues that really came out of the budget were very minor in terms of omnibus legislation of past. So I think that as a whole is a win for the government.
So you just talked about, Jon, the coalition between the NDP and the Liberals and what they were able to accomplish. I'm going to flip that now to the Conservatives. And Jake, I'll throw this to you. During all of this, we had the Freedom Convoy that was on earlier this year in Ottawa and at borders across the country. That ultimately led to a breakdown, if you will, in the Conservative Party, in that they tossed their leader, your former boss, Erin O'Toole. I'm just wondering how this might have all impacted the last few months in terms of the Conservatives and trying to hold the government to account.
Well, it exposed within the Conservative movement perhaps the most fundamental divide among activists and MPs, and that's the divide between those who believe their ideology should better reflect reality and the society around them, and those MPs and activists who believe that their ideology, that reality, and society should better reflect their ideology. And because that rift has been exposed, the party looked inward and instead did not focus on its actual job, which is holding Justin Trudeau to account. And Jon mentioned something I think is really smart. From a tactics perspective, indeed, the coalition did allow the government to move on its legislative agenda at a speed in which it has not accomplished in minority parliament. And at times it seemed it was moving quicker than it could in a majority parliament. And the Conservatives were unable to kind of make a grand stand on any one single issue as it had in the past, because those procedural tools that are used, and rightly so, to slow legislation down, to question legislation, were taken out of their hands. And it really has harmed Candace Bergen's, albeit short time, to solidify any kind of legacy as the interim leader.
Interesting that you pick up on that, Jay, because that's where I was going next. And that is, we're talking about Candace Bergen in a short term as interim leader, because we're in the midst of a leadership race, if you will, with 6 candidates, and the Conservatives will choose a new party leader on September 10th. So the next couple of months, while everyone is doing barbecue circuits, is really critical for whoever wants to be the new leader. I'm just wondering, what's at stake for this leadership race and for whoever is going to take the helm of the Conservative Party?
It's the heart and soul of the party is what it's at stake. And it's a question about about how exactly Conservatives are going to form a winning national coalition. I've talked about this before. I don't think the core beliefs of the Conservative Party are at stake in this leadership race. I think Conservatives largely agree on the core beliefs of the party around fiscal restraint and social responsibility. What Conservatives are divided on, what's at stake, is how we form that national coalition and form a winning, sustainable one at that. Do we try to capitalize on culture wars? Do we try to get into fights with premiers and local politicians when we think it benefits us? These are the core questions, I believe, that are in dispute right now during this race, and the direction which will be decided depending on the leader who's chosen.
Jon, I just want to pick up on something you were talking about earlier when you were talking about the coalition and accomplishments and committees. So we're on this break. A few bills got passed just before the MPs left. Senate has been dealing with some as well. When we come back in the fall, it seems like a fair amount, though, has been pushed to the fall. And I'm wondering, when the MPs return on September 19th, what's some key bills that you will be watching for?
Yeah, I think if anything, the most contentious of those, certainly from an opposition standpoint, I think we'll see a lot of opposition, primarily from the Conservative, on a couple number one priority bills for them, which will include the Online Broadcasting Act, and a couple relevant bills associated to that would also include the recently tabled privacy bill that's come forward by François-Philippe Champagne, the Minister of Industry, who seemingly is retabling effectively the digital charter bill from Navdeep Bains a few years ago, and we all remember how that went. So I could see that going down a certain path. What's really going to be interesting as well to me coming out of the summer is going to be how the government's going to end up responding to the report recently proposed to government by the Special Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying. I think this is going to be another one of those issues, which, again, as we saw a couple of years ago, as this was going through the House, it was contentious not just within the party itself, but also across party lines. So it'll be interesting to see how the government's going to want to come forward to that, because there were a couple of really contentious issues included within there, including the issue of mature minors. Of course, that's a touchy subject, so it's going to be interesting to see how that balance is struck.
Jake, is there anything that you're going to be keeping your eyes on then over the course of the next couple of months and when Parliament returns in September?
Yeah, I think it's all about the air war, as we call it, the mudslinging, if you will. As John's rightly pointed out a couple times now, the legislative agenda is largely solidified. Whatever the government wants to pass, it's going to be able to pass with the NDP's support, and they're going to be able to do it fairly quickly. What will be interesting as the economic challenges of the country ramp up, as rate hikes put pressure on people to pay their mortgages, it will be interesting to me to see how quickly the Liberals attempt to define the apparent frontrunner Pierre Poilievre with Canadians before he can really sink his teeth into the economic issues and use his newfound platform as opposition leader to communicate on what are very saleable issues and issues that make the government very, very vulnerable, even in the long term.
Lots to watch in the course of the next couple of months. That's all the time we have. Thank you to my colleagues at Syntax Strategic, Jon Dugal and Jake Enwright. I'm Janet Silver. Till next time.